Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. Tonight, we are going somewhere very old, somewhere wide and windswept, where the grass runs all the way to the horizon and the sky feels closer than it should. A place where a single human life, beginning in almost complete obscurity, would slowly reshape the entire world, not through luck, not through birthright, but through something harder to name, something that formed in silence, in hunger, in years of being left with nothing. We are going to the Mongolian steppe, and we are going to begin at the beginning. Before we move any further into this story, I want to pause for just a moment, and before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. Now, the steppe. In the 1160s, the land that would one day be called Mongolia was not a country. It was not a kingdom. It had no cities, no written language, no single governing power. It was a vast, open expanse of grassland and cold home to dozens of nomadic tribes who moved with the seasons, tended their animals, and warred with one another in patterns that had continued for generations. Life there was not gentle. The land itself was not gentle. Winter came early and stayed long, and the space between one family and the next could stretch for miles of unbroken silence. Into this world, sometime around the year 1162, a boy was born. His name was Temüjin. His father was a minor chieftain of the Betrayal clan, a man of some standing, though not great power. His mother was named Holun. She had been taken from another man to become his father's wife, which was a common enough story on the steppe, where the rules of the wider world did not reach. Temüjin was born by some accounts with a blood clot in his fist. Those who noticed took it as a sign of something. They were not wrong, though none of them could have known what that something would become. His early years were ordinary in the way that hard lives are ordinary, full of cold and movement, and the particular closeness that comes from living with very little. He learned to ride before he could read, which was fine, because there was nothing to read. He learned to hunt. He learned the rhythms of the steppe, and then, when he was around 9 years old, everything changed. His father was poisoned. The men who did it were from a rival tribe, the Tatars, long-standing enemies of the Betrayal. Temüjin's father had gone to arrange a marriage for his son, and he had accepted food and drink along the way. He did not come home the same man. He died slowly, on the journey back, and with him went whatever protection and standing the family had carried. What followed was a kind of abandonment that is difficult to sit with, even across the distance of 800 years. The clan, the people Temüjin's father had led, the men and women who owed their loyalty to his family, left. They gathered their animals and their belongings and moved away, leaving Holun and her children behind on the open steppe with almost nothing. No food stores to speak of, no allies, no one coming back. The reasoning, if it can be called that, was practical in the cold way that survival often is. A widow with young children was a burden. A boy of 9 could not lead. There was no future in staying beside a family that had lost its chieftain, and so the clan chose its own future and walked away from theirs. Holun did not collapse. This is the part of the story that deserves to be held for a moment, because it is easy to move past it on the way to the more well-known chapters. She gathered what she could. She fed her children on roots and berries, and whatever the land offered. She kept them alive through winters that had no right to be survived. She was, in ways that Temüjin would carry with him for the rest of his life, the first example he ever had of what it meant to endure without flinching. Those years on the edge of survival left marks that never fully faded. The hunger was real, the isolation was real, and the knowledge learned early and learned completely that the world would not offer mercy simply because it was needed, settled into Temüjin, the way cold settles into stone. That safety had to be built and held and defended. That loyalty was the rarest and most valuable thing one person could offer another. All of it gathered quietly inside him during those long, still years on the plain. He was not yet a leader. He was not yet anything the wider world would notice. He was a boy on an empty plain, learning what it meant to have nothing, and learning slowly what he was willing to do to ensure he never had nothing again. The years ahead would be harder still before they began to turn. There was more loss waiting, more danger, more moments where the story could have ended quietly and completely, but it did not end. And in the not ending, something was forming, patient and steady, and not yet visible to anyone watching from the outside. We are only just at the beginning. The steppe in winter is a place that asks nothing of you and offers nothing in return. It simply continues, flat and pale and indifferent, stretching in every direction without a landmark to hold the eye. The sky sits low in those months, pressing down against the frozen ground, and the wind moves through the grass with a sound that is not quite silence and not quite anything else. It is a landscape that has no interest in the people living inside it, and for a boy growing up on its edges, that indifference was perhaps the most honest teacher he would ever have. Temüjin grew in that landscape, not smoothly, not without difficulty, but the way things grow when the conditions are hard, slowly and close to the ground, with roots that go deeper than they need to, because the surface has never been reliable. The steppe does not encourage softness. It simply continues, and the people within it continue alongside it, shaped by the same long patience. His mother Holan had held the family through the worst of it, and what Temüjin was becoming in those years was shaped in part by watching her. There was something else forming in him too, something harder to name, though anyone who has ever been very young and very hungry will recognize it. It is the particular kind of clarity that arrives when everything unnecessary has been stripped away. When there is no comfort to retreat into, you learn very precisely what you are made of, and what Temüjin was made of was beginning to show. There was a moment, he was perhaps 14 or 15, when that interior life became visible in a way that could not be looked away from. He had a half-brother named Begta. The two of them were in conflict over something small and essential at the same time, the way conflicts between hungry people often are. The matter was food, and who had the right to it. The details are sparse, as details from that world often are. What remains is the outcome. Temüjin, along with his younger brother Kasa, confronted Begta on the open plain. Begta did not survive the confrontation. He sat and faced what was coming without moving away, and Temüjin let it be done. It is not a moment that softens with time. It is simply there, early in the record of his life, a reminder that the ruthlessness people would later find in the Conqueror was not something he discovered on a battlefield. It was present from the beginning, forged in the same long fire as everything else. The world around him was not made of mercy, and he had learned to reflect that back without hesitation. Not long after, the world demonstrated again how little it intended to offer him. A rival clan, the Temüjin, the same people who had once claimed authority over his father's lineage, came for him. Temüjin was captured and placed in a wooden restraint called a kang, a heavy frame worn around the neck and shoulders that made movement difficult and sleep nearly impossible. He was held as a kind of prisoner, passed between households, watched and diminished. He escaped. The account of how involves a sympathetic family who sheltered him, a river he remained hidden in through the cold, and a dim stretch of night that covered his movement long enough for him to slip away. The details feel almost too spare to hold the weight of what they contain. A young man alone, finding his way back through a landscape that offered no guarantees, but he found his family, and the finding mattered, not just as a fact but as a pattern. Temüjin, across all the difficult years of his early life, kept returning. He was taken, and he returned. He was left with nothing, and he gathered something. He was moved to the edge of the story, and he came back toward the center of it, patient and quiet, and not yet finished. There was a young woman in his life by this point, or beginning to be. Her name was Berthe. The arrangement had been made by his father years before, in the way such things were made on the steppe, an alliance between families, sealed with the promise of a future marriage. When Yasuge died, that future had seemed to go with him, but Temüjin had not forgotten, and when the worst of the survival years had passed enough to allow for movement, he went to her family and honored what his father had made. Bertha came with a gift, a beautiful sable coat, the kind of thing that carried real value on the steppe, where warmth and wealth were often the same word. Temüjin took that coat and did something with it that reveals more about who he was becoming than almost anything else from this period. He did not keep it. He used it to strengthen a bond he knew he needed, offering it to Togrul, a powerful leader of the Kera tribe, who had once been an ally of his father. It was a small gesture and a large one at the same time. A young man with very little spending what he had on a relationship he believed in. Togrul accepted, and a door that had been closed began, very slowly, to open. Temüjin was learning something that would define everything that came after. That loyalty, carefully placed, was more lasting than any other currency available to him. And he was beginning, quietly and deliberately, to spend it well. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. The steppe in winter has a particular quality of silence, not the silence of a room, or a forest, or a valley, something wider than those, something that does not acknowledge the difference between one place and the next. It simply continues in every direction, pale and unhurried, holding whatever stands within it, without any special concern for whether that thing survives. Temüjin had grown up inside that silence. He had learned, slowly and without anyone teaching him, that it was neither hostile nor kind. It was simply the condition of the world he had been given, and the only useful response to it was to keep moving. He was still young, somewhere in his early 20s, and what he had gathered so far was modest by any measure. A family, a few animals, a wife, a fragile thread of alliance with Togrul, of the Karit. These were not nothing, but they were not much either, and the steppe had a way of reminding you of the distance between what you held and what you needed. Then the Merkit came. The Merkit were a tribe with an old grievance, one that reached back before Temüjin was born, to the circumstances of his parents' marriage, which had involved a woman taken from their people. Debts of that kind were not forgotten on the steppe. They were simply stored, the way cold is stored in the ground through a long winter, waiting for the right season to return. And when the Merkit came, they came in force, arriving before there was time to prepare. Berta was taken. Temüjin went to Togrul, and he went to Jamuka, the blood brother of his childhood, the boy he had once sworn an oath beside a frozen river, and he asked for their help. Both came. What followed was his first real military campaign, a coordinated movement across difficult ground aimed at recovering what had been taken from him. The Merkit camp was found. Berta was returned. There is something worth staying with in how Temüjin handled this moment. He had been wronged, and he had responded, not with helpless grief, not with isolated fury, but with the careful assembly of the right people in the right arrangement, aimed at a clear purpose. He had called on loyalty, and he had offered loyalty in return, and it had worked. The campaign against the Merkit was not simply a rescue, it was a demonstration, the first of many, of what Temüjin was slowly becoming. Someone who could move other people toward a shared purpose and bring them home again. Berta remained at the center of his life from that point forward. She was not simply a presence in the background of the story. She was counsel, she was constancy, and in the years ahead, she would prove to be among the steadiest things he had. He had gone to retrieve her at considerable risk, and the fact of that retrieval, the willingness to spend everything he had built to bring her back, was something neither of them would forget. Jamuka was another matter. The bond between them was real and old, and had survived a great deal. They had grown up in the same world, spoken the same language of loyalty and obligation, shared the same understanding of how the steppe worked. But somewhere in the years that followed the Merkit campaign, something between them began, very quietly, to shift. They rode together for a time, camped together, moved through the same territory, and then they did not. The parting was not loud. It rarely is, when two people have been genuinely close and find themselves moving in different directions. What separated them was not personal, exactly, or not only personal. It was something deeper than a disagreement between two men. Jamuka believed in the old order of things, the world where lineage and bloodline determined who led and who followed, where the standing of birth was the natural shape of power. Temüjin had been building something else entirely. He was gathering men around him based on what they could do, on whether they were loyal, on whether they could be trusted when the cold came and the food ran low. He took in men others had set aside. He offered place and belonging to those who had neither. The distinction sounds simple, but on the steppe in the 12th century, it was nothing less than a reimagining of how human groups could be organized. It was a slow, quiet departure from everything that had come before, not announced, not declared, simply lived out across the long seasons. Other leaders noticed. Some came to him. Some moved against him. The years between the rescue of Berta and the great gathering that still lay ahead were years of slow accumulation. Alliances formed, tested, broken, and gradually remade. Battles that are now mostly nameless. Winters that have left no record. A long, patient process of becoming, carried out across a landscape that offered no shortcuts and remembered no promises. The man emerging from all of this was not yet Genghis Khan. He was still Temüjin, still recognizable as the boy who had survived the abandonment, the enslavement, the loss. But something in him had been gradually clarifying, the way a distant shape on the steppe slowly resolves into something definite as you draw nearer to it. He was beginning to understand what he was building, and what he was building was unlike anything the steppe had held before. Jamukha had a name for what he was doing, or at least a way of describing it that carried a certain weight among the old families of the steppe. He called Temüjin a gatherer of the broken, and he did not mean it warmly. The men who came to Temüjin's fires were, in Jamukha's view, the discarded ones, the men without standing, the ones no bloodline would claim. That such men were now forming the core of something powerful was to Jamukha a kind of disorder, a loosening of the natural arrangement of things. But those men were loyal in a way that men who follow lineage rarely are. They had chosen Temüjin, and he had chosen them. And between those two choices, something had been woven that held firm under pressure. On the steppe, where everything could be taken away in a single cold season, that kind of loyalty was not a small thing. It was the only thing that endured. The distance between Temüjin and Jamukha widened slowly, the way rivers that begin close together gradually find their own separate courses across a wide plain. There was no single moment of separation. There were instead many smaller moments, a decision made without the other's counsel, a camp moved without explanation, a messenger arriving with words that carried an edge beneath their surface. And then, one season, they were no longer riding toward the same horizon. What followed was not immediate. The steppe did not move at the pace of a single season. It moved at the pace of long accumulation of alliances gathering the way water gathers in low places. Slowly and without announcement, Temüjin spent years building what could not be built in a single campaign. He was patient in a way that his enemies consistently failed to understand. They would see him quiet and assume he was still. He was never still. The tribal world around him was not a stable one. Clans shifted, old loyalties dissolved when the weather turned, or the herds moved. Leaders rose on the strength of a single victory, and faded when fortune withdrew. What Temüjin was constructing was something different, a structure that did not depend on the mood of a single season, or the standing of a single family. He was building something that held its shape regardless of what the wind was doing. He reorganized the way his growing forces were arranged, not by clan, not by bloodline, but by units of 10, then 100, then 1,000. A man served alongside whoever else was in his unit. Regardless of where he had come from or who his father had been, the unit became the new family. A commander earned his position through what he did, and could lose it the same way. This was not how the steppe had ever worked before. It was a quiet change, carried out not through proclamation, but through the slow daily reality of how men ate and slept and moved together. Alongside this, something else was gradually taking shape, a gathering of principles and rules that would eventually be known as the Yasa, not a written document in those early years, but a slow accumulation of the ways things were to be done within Temüjin's growing world. Theft was addressed, the treatment of those who surrendered was addressed, and religious practice was left alone entirely. A man could hold whatever understanding of the sacred he carried, and it would not be held against him. In a world where belief was often the first thing used to separate one group from another, this was unusual enough to linger with for a moment. None of this softened what he was. He remained capable of a severity that those who crossed him came to understand in full. The same man who offered shelter to the outcast could, when he felt betrayal, respond in ways that left no uncertainty about the cost. The two things lived in him together, and he never seemed to find them at odds. Generosity and severity were, in his understanding, simply different expressions of the same underlying principle, that loyalty had a value, and that its absence had a consequence. Jamukha was watching all of this from his own camp, across whatever distance now lay between them. He had his own followers, his own fires, his own claim to leadership among the Mongol-speaking peoples of the steppe. And the two men who had once sworn brotherhood to each other now moved through the same world as something closer to opposing forces, not yet fully opposed, but no longer the same thing either. The years continued their slow passage. The landscape held everything in its usual silence, and somewhere within that silence, the shape of what was coming was already present, the way the form of a season can be felt in the air long before it arrives. The reckoning between Temüjin and Jamukha was still ahead, and it would carry with it everything that their years of closeness had been building toward, all of the old tenderness and all of the distance that had grown between it. The distance between two men who were once close carries its own particular weight. It is not like the distance between strangers, which is simply empty. It is a distance that has something in it, the memory of what used to be there, still faintly present, the way warmth lingers in a stone long after the fire beside it has gone out. Temüjin and Jamukha moved through those years with that kind of distance between them. Their followers grew, their reputations deepened, and the steppe, which had always been large enough to hold many things at once, held them both separately now, each gathering strength in his own way, each drawing men toward a different understanding of what Mongol leadership could mean. Jamukha was not a small figure. He was gifted and well regarded, and he carried the weight of an older tradition, the idea that leadership flowed through bloodline and aristocratic standing. He believed the natural order of the tribes was something to be preserved rather than remade. He had followers who believed in that order sincerely, men who had grown up inside it and found it sensible, and Jamukha himself was capable of real brilliance. The bond he had once shared with Temüjin had not been one-sided. He had offered it genuinely, and it had been genuinely received. But the two visions had grown in different directions. The way two rivers fed by the same source can eventually reach entirely separate valleys. Temüjin's world was one where a man's worth was demonstrated through what he did, and how he held his loyalty, not through who his father had been. Jamukha's world preserved a hierarchy that Temüjin had, in some sense, been excluded from since childhood. The steppe had made both men, but it had made them differently. There were confrontations between their forces in those years, not a single moment of resolution, but a slow series of encounters, with alliances shifting around them, and other leaders choosing sides or attempting to remain apart from the growing division. The tribes of the Mongolian world were not simply waiting for one of these two men to prevail. They were living their own lives, making their own calculations, trying to survive the same seasons that had always demanded survival. But the gravity of what Temüjin was building was becoming harder to remain neutral against. He continued to draw people in. A man who had served an opposing clan, and served them well, might find upon arriving in Temüjin's camp that his competence was noticed and used rather than held against him. Former opponents were folded into the structure without being made to feel the full weight of having once stood on the other side. This was not softness. It was a form of practical wisdom that Temüjin seemed to understand without needing to be taught. A man given a reason to belong would fight differently than a man who had simply been absorbed. The messenger network slowly forming across his growing territory carried this same logic. Riders moved between camps, carrying news and orders, resting at intervals where horses and supplies were held in readiness. The system allowed information to move across vast distances, with a steadiness that had not existed before. It was not yet the formal relay that would later stretch across the full width of his empire, but the thinking behind it was already present, already being practiced in smaller form, already changing how decisions could be made and carried out across open ground. And through all of this, the memory of Berta remained close to him. She had been returned to him years before, and she remained his first wife, the one whose standing within his household was never diminished by the many others who came after. In a world where such arrangements were common, the particular care he held for her was noted by those around him. She was not simply present, her counsel was regarded, and he listened to it. This too was part of who he was, capable of a loyalty that ran in both directions, not only demanding it from others, but offering something genuine in return. His mother Holun was still living. She was the woman who had held her children together on the open plain after everything had been taken from them, who had fed them on roots and berries, and the sheer force of her refusal to let them disappear. She remained a presence in his life and in his camp. He did not leave her behind as he grew. She traveled with the world he was building. Jamukha's position was narrowing. As the years moved forward, the leaders who had once balanced between the two men found that balance harder to maintain. Alliances that had seemed stable began to resolve themselves, one by one, in Temüjin's direction, not always through force, sometimes simply through the growing sense that the shape of the future was becoming visible and that it had Temüjin's outline. The final confrontation, when it came, would not feel like a surprise to anyone who had been watching. It had been arriving for a long time. The steppe had been holding it the way it held everything, patiently, without comment, letting the seasons do their slow work. What happened between the two former brothers, in those last moments of their long story, is one of the places where the history of this time becomes something more than the movement of armies and the movement of power. It becomes something quieter, something that asks to be held gently rather than explained. That part of the story is still just ahead. The final meeting between Temüjin and Conqueror did not happen on a great open field, with armies watching from a distance and banners moving in the wind. It came quietly, the way most endings do, after the larger noise had already settled, after the last of those who had stood beside Conqueror had either fallen away or changed sides. He was brought before Temüjin by men who had once followed him, men who offered their former leader as a kind of proof of their new loyalty. Temüjin did not receive this well, not the capture itself, but the manner of it. The men who had handed Conqueror over were not rewarded, they were condemned. A man who would betray his own leader was not the kind of man Temüjin wanted inside his world. Loyalty was the thing he had built everything upon, and its opposite was not something he would allow to go unremarked, even when the result of that betrayal happened to serve him. Conqueror, for his part, did not ask to be spared. He asked for a death that carried some dignity, a death without blood, which was the Mongol way of honoring someone whose spirit was considered too significant to be shed carelessly on the ground. He had lived his life as a man of standing, and he wished to leave it the same way. There is something in that request that lingers with the story long after the moment itself has passed. The two of them had once sworn brotherhood in the language of the steppe. They had exchanged gifts and spoken promises that were meant to outlast everything. And now here they were, at the far end of all of that, one of them with the world in his hands and the other asking only for a quiet close. Temüjin granted it. Conqueror was put to death without the shedding of blood. Whatever passed between them in those final moments was not recorded in any form that survives. The silence around it is its own kind of weight. With Conqueror gone, the last meaningful opposition within the Mongol world dissolved. The tribes that had remained apart, the leaders who had held themselves at a careful distance from both men, found that the distance had closed around them. There was no longer a second center to move toward, there was only one. And so what followed arrived not as a sudden change, but as something that had been slowly becoming inevitable, a gathering, an acknowledgement, a moment where the world that had been forming for so long was finally given a name. The gathering was called a Kurultai, a great assembly of the Mongol people, held on the open plain beside the Onon River, where Temüjin had wandered in his earliest years. The leaders of the unified tribes came together and raised a white banner of 9 tails, the symbol of a new order emerging from the long years of movement and loss and patient labor. And there, in the place where the grass ran long and the sky held everything without preference, Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. He was somewhere around 44 years of age. The title carried something like universal ruler or lord of all. He had not inherited a throne. He had assembled one, piece by piece, out of nothing but the force of what he understood about people and power, and the long patience required to bring both together. Everything that had come before, the hunger, the years moving across cold ground, the slow and careful gathering of men who believed in something different, all of it had been a kind of prologue to this moment. The world he now led was not simply a collection of tribes that had agreed to stop fighting. It was something more considered than that. He had already begun reshaping how the Mongol people understood themselves, not as members of separate clans defined by bloodline and old grievance, but as a single people with a shared purpose and a shared set of rules. The old divisions were not merely set aside, they were formally dissolved. A man's tribe of origin would no longer determine his rank or his role. What mattered was what he could do, and whether he could be trusted to do it. The law code he established was known as the Yasa. It was not written down in a single document, at least not in any form that has fully survived. But its principles moved through the empire. the way water moves through open land, finding every available channel, settling into every space that would receive it. It applied to everyone within his reach, regardless of where they had come from. Theft was forbidden. Betrayal was forbidden. The destruction of water sources, so vital on the steppe and in the dry lands beyond it, was forbidden. Religious practice of any kind was to be left undisturbed. These were not suggestions. They were the structure of the world he was making, and they held. He reorganized the army along the same lines, not by tribe, but by units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Men who had once been enemies found themselves standing beside each other in the same formation, bound not by shared ancestry, but by shared obligation. The commanders of those units were chosen for their ability. Rank was earned, not given. This too was something the old world had not offered. What he had built by 1206 was still, in one sense, a beginning. The steppe had been gathered, but beyond the steppe, the larger world was still going about its own affairs. Empires and kingdoms and trade cities, none of them yet fully aware of what had quietly taken shape on the open plain to the north. That awareness was coming, slowly at first, and then with a steadiness that would leave very little unchanged. The army that moved out from the steppe was unlike anything the surrounding world had seen assembled in one place, not because of its size alone, though the size was considerable. It was the way it moved, with a kind of quiet coordination that felt less like a military force and more like weather, organized, patient, and very difficult to stop once it had begun. The Mongol soldier traveled light. He carried what he needed, and nothing more. A small horse bred for endurance rather than appearance could cover distances that would have seemed impossible to armies accustomed to marching on foot with heavy supply lines trailing behind them. The Mongols brought their supply with them in the form of movement itself, grazing herds, dried provisions, the ability to live on the land as they crossed it. They did not need to wait for food to arrive. They were already moving through it. And they had learned to communicate across enormous distances with a system that was, for its time, without equal. Relay stations were placed at regular intervals across the expanding territory, each one staffed, each one supplied with fresh horses. A message could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, passing from rider to rider, like something carried on the wind. Genghis Khan could know what was happening at the far edge of his reach, before most rulers of that era would have even heard that something had occurred. This was the YAM, the relay network that held the empire together, the way a nervous system holds a body together, carrying information steadily inward and outward, keeping the whole aware of its own parts. It was not a glamorous system, it did not announce itself, but without it, the distances involved would have made sustained coordination nearly impossible, and the empire would have remained a collection of victories rather than a functioning whole. He also understood something that many conquerors before him had not fully grasped, that the world beyond the steppe contained knowledge worth keeping. Scholars, engineers, administrators, physicians. When a city came under Mongol influence, those with useful skills were often preserved and brought into the broader structure rather than lost. A man who could read the stars, or manage a grain supply, or design a siege engine, was worth far more alive and working than otherwise. The empire absorbed talent the way the steppe absorbed rainfall, slowly, completely, and without ceremony. Religious life was treated with the same practical openness. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian priests, Taoist teachers, all of them moved through Mongol territory without interference, so long as they did not interfere with the order of things. Genghis Khan himself held his own spiritual beliefs, rooted in the Tengris traditions of the steppe. He seems to have understood that the divine was not something any one tradition held entirely on its own. He listened to many of them. He committed to none of them exclusively. There is something in that quality, the willingness to take in what was useful from wherever it came, that runs through everything he built. It was the same quality that had allowed him to gather broken men and former enemies into a loyal force on the steppe. The same quality that had led him to reorganize an army by merit rather than ancestry. He was not attached to the way things had always been done. He was attached to what worked. The first great test of that system beyond the steppe came not from a desire for conquest in the way that word is usually understood, but from something more specific. A trade delegation he had sent to the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and prosperous realm stretching across much of Central Asia and into Persia, was met not with the customary protections afforded to envoys and merchants, but with something else entirely. the governor of a border city, ordered the delegation detained. The merchants were killed. When Genghis Khan sent a second delegation to address the matter formally, those envoys were killed as well. It was a profound miscalculation on the part of the Khwarezmian Shah. Whether it came from arrogance or from a genuine underestimation of what was gathering to the north and east, is something that history has not fully resolved. What is clear is that the response it produced was measured, deliberate, and on a scale that the Shah had not prepared for. Genghis Khan did not move immediately. He is said to have spent time in solitude before the campaign began, withdrawing to a place of stillness, as he sometimes did before decisions of great weight. Whatever passed through his mind during those days, what emerged from them was a plan of considerable complexity. Multiple armies moved across different routes at once, converging on targets separated by vast distances, coordinated through that same relay network that now stretched across the whole of his domain. Cities that received the Mongol advance with openness were generally spared and absorbed into the broader order. Those that did not faced consequences that were severe and lasting. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had stood for generations as one of the most powerful states in the known world, did not survive the campaign in any recognizable form. Within a few years, it had ceased to exist as a political entity. The Shah himself fled westward, pursued by a Mongol force that followed him across land and sea, until he died on a small island in the Caspian alone, and without the empire he had once commanded. What remained in the wake of that campaign was an open road westward into lands that had not yet heard the sound of Mongol horses, and eastward into territories still being drawn into the growing shape of something that had no real name yet, only an expanding edge. That open road was not simply a military corridor. It was something more like a silence, a vast, unguarded stretch of the world that had not yet been folded into the shape of what Genghis Khan was building, and he was always building. Even in the years of movement and campaign, the administrative mind that had reorganized the Mongol tribes from within was still at work, still weaving something larger and more durable than any single victory. There is a tendency, when following a life of this scale, to move from conquest to conquest as though that were the whole story. But the empire that was forming was not only made of campaigns, it was made of roads and messengers and laws that applied the same way to a herdsman as to a general. It was made of the decision to allow people of different faiths to practice as they wished, without interference from above. These were not small choices in a world where religion and power had always been deeply entangled. They were deliberate, and they held things together in ways that force alone never could have. Quietly, from the inside, the way something woven holds its shape long after the weaving is done. The yam was one of the quieter achievements of that era, and one of the most far-reaching. It was a relay network, a long chain of riders and stations spread across the empire, each one positioned so that a message never had to travel too far before being passed to a fresh horse and a fresh rider. In this way, information could move hundreds of miles within a single day, flowing steadily across distances that had once felt impossible to cross. What had been a vast and isolating landscape became something more like a slow conversation. The world did not shrink all at once. It narrowed gradually, station by station, the way a river narrows as it finds its course, and what had once separated people began, in some small way, to connect them. Trade followed the same roads. Merchants who had once faced the uncertainty of moving between rival states, each with its own laws, its own tolerances, its own dangers, found themselves passing through something more unified than anything they had known before. The Silk Road, which had always existed as a loose and fragile thing, began to function with a steadiness it had rarely held. Goods moved along it, and ideas moved with them, drifting from one end of the world toward the other, the way seeds move on a slow wind. Genghis Khan was somewhere in his early 60s by this point. He had spent the better part of 4 decades in motion, in cold, in the particular weariness that comes from never fully stopping. The body carries those years differently than the mind does. The mind, by many accounts, remained clear and deliberate, still capable of holding the full complexity of an empire that now stretched across a distance that would have been beyond imagining for the boy who had once survived on roots and small animals on the Mongolian plain. He was still campaigning. The campaign against the Tangut kingdom in the northwest of what is now China had been ongoing for some time, a long and unresolved matter that he had returned to with characteristic patience. He did not leave things unfinished. That quality had been present since the very beginning, since the days when he had nothing and still refused to remain still. It was part of how he was made. It was during this campaign, in the summer of 1227, that he died. He was somewhere around 65 years old. The precise cause has never been fully settled. Illness, a fall from a horse, the accumulated weight of a life spent entirely in the field. What is known is that he had asked for the campaign to continue in his absence. Even at the end, the work was not finished, and he did not want it to pause on his account. His body was carried back across the steppe. The procession moved quietly, as such things do when they carry something that cannot be replaced. The burial site was chosen somewhere in the landscape he had always known, the rolling, open country near the Khenti Mountains in what is now Mongolia, and then it was hidden, not marked, not announced. The ground was returned to its natural appearance, and the location was kept from the wider world with a deliberateness that has held across nearly 8 centuries, with a completeness that is difficult to fully comprehend. There are stories surrounding the burial, the lengths taken to ensure the site would remain unknown. Whether every detail of those stories is precisely accurate is something that cannot be confirmed. What is certain is the outcome. The grave of the man who reshaped the world has never been found. He went back into the earth the same way he had always moved, without announcing himself, without leaving more than was necessary. Mongolia still observes a kind of respectful quiet around the question of where he lies. There have been searches, conducted carefully and with modern tools, and they have found nothing conclusive. The steppe holds its silence on this particular matter, the way it holds most things, patiently, and without any sign of yielding. What he left behind, though, was not quiet at all. The empire continued. His sons and grandsons carried it further, westward into Russia and toward the edges of Europe, deeper into China, southward into lands that had never seen a Mongol army. The shape of what he had built kept expanding for decades after the man himself was gone, following the momentum of a life that had been, from its very first years, entirely directed outward. And the world that emerged from all of that movement, the world on the other side of the Mongol century, was a different place than the one that had existed before. The world that came after him was not simply larger in its borders. It was woven together in ways it had never been before, threads of trade and language and medicine, and idea passing between places that had previously existed in almost complete ignorance of one another. A merchant moving along the roads that crossed the Mongol lands in the decades following his death could travel from the eastern edge of China to the shores of the Black Sea with a degree of safety that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. The roads were maintained, the relay stations were staffed, the law held across an enormous distance. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, as historians have come to call it, not a perfect peace, and not without its costs, but a kind of order, settled over a vast stretch of the world that allowed movement and exchange on a scale that had not existed before. Silk moved westward along those roads, slowly and steadily, carried by merchants who understood the routes well. Spices moved. Ideas about astronomy and mathematics and medicine traveled along those same paths, carried by scholars and physicians who found themselves welcome in courts, very far from home. The printing press that would eventually emerge in Europe had its roots, in part, in technologies that moved along those routes, ideas that had begun somewhere else and drifted gradually westward over many generations. Paper money, too, was an idea that had long existed in China, and it was during this period that the concept began to find its way into the understanding of the West. Each of these things arrived quietly, without announcement, the way most large changes do. The concept of diplomatic immunity, the protection of ambassadors and envoys, was something the Mongol Empire enforced with a seriousness that would go on to shape how later civilizations thought about the same question. These were not small things. They were the quiet residue of a system built deliberately, by a man who understood that an empire held together only by force would not hold for long. Marco Polo traveled through the Mongol world in the latter half of the 13th century, moving through lands that were still under Mongol governance, still organized along the lines established during and after the Great Unification. What he described when he returned, the scale of the cities, the sophistication of the courts, The sheer distances involved was received in Europe with a kind of disbelief. That disbelief says something about how completely the two ends of the world had been separated before the Mongol roads opened between them. And then gradually, the empire began to soften at its edges. Not all at once, and not in any single moment. The descendants of the great unification settled into the lands they governed. And as they settled, they changed. They adopted local religions, local languages, local customs. The Ilkhanate in Persia became Persian in many of its ways. The Golden Horde in the west absorbed the rhythms of the steppe lands it occupied. Kublai Khan, who ruled China as the founder of the Yuan dynasty, governed in a manner that owed as much to Chinese tradition as to Mongolian. The empire did not so much collapse as slowly become the places it had absorbed. It dissolved at the edges first, then further in, until what had been one vast and unified thing was many smaller things again, each shaped by its own landscape and its own inherited ways. There is something worth lingering with in that image, the way a great unified form can gradually soften into the very ground it once covered. This is one of the quieter ironies woven into the whole story. The empire built by a man who refused to be defined by any single tradition, who gathered people of every background and rewarded them by what they could do, rather than where they had come from, eventually dissolved into the very traditions it had moved through. The conquerors became local. The vast thing became many smaller things, each finding its own shape again. The Black Death, which moved westward along those same trade routes in the mid-14th century, belongs to a chapter well beyond the man himself. The roads that carried silk and ideas also carried, without anyone understanding what was happening, something far more consequential than either. The connectivity that had been one of the great achievements of the Mongol century became, in this, one of its most devastating unintended consequences. The world that had been opened was open in every direction, and through all of it, the expansion, the trade, the gradual dissolution, the unintended consequences, moving along the roads, the man at the beginning remained a figure that no single description could hold. In Mongolia, he is a founding ancestor, a source of national identity so deep that his image appears on currency and on the sides of buildings, and the airport in the capital carries his name. In the lands that bore the weight of the campaigns, the memory is carried differently, as something that arrived from the horizon and changed everything, not gently. Both of these things are true at once. The man who rose from nothing on the open steppe left behind a world that was genuinely measurably different from the one he had entered. The roots were real, the exchange was real, the loss was real. The scale of all of it, the building and the breaking both, sits together in the historical record without resolving into something simpler. What remains, at the far end of all that distance, is something worth sitting with slowly. A life that began with almost nothing, on an empty plain, in a century that has no written record of his earliest years. A life that ended having moved more of the world than any single person before or since. And somewhere between those 2 points, between the abandoned boy and the man whose name still carries weight across 8 centuries, there is a story that does not quite fit inside any single frame. All of it, the boy, the man, the empire, and everything that followed, comes to rest here, at the end of a long evening, in something quiet and still. And so we arrive at the far edge of a very long story, where the last of the light has faded, and what remains simply is, without needing to be anything more. There is a plain in Mongolia that stretches further than the eye can follow in any direction. The grass moves in long, slow waves when the wind crosses it, the way water moves when something has passed through, and the surface is only now returning to itself. It is the kind of place that holds silence without effort, a silence so old and so complete that it seems to belong to the land rather than to the absence of sound. Somewhere on a plain very much like this one, a boy stood alone once, with nothing ahead of him that anyone could have called a future. That boy carried nothing forward except the will to remain. He had no inheritance, no title, no clan willing to stand beside him. What he had was a mother who did not give in, and something inside himself that proved, over a very long and difficult passage of years, to be stronger than the circumstances arranged against him. He did not know, standing there, what he would become. That is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the beginning of it. What he built was not inevitable. The alliances were woven from loyalty rather than lineage, something that had rarely been done before on the steppe where bloodline was everything. The system of law he established reached across every tribe and tradition, holding together people who had no reason to trust one another except that it was now required of them. The roads came later, long and steady, carrying goods and letters and ideas from one end of the known world to the other. None of it arrived fully formed. It emerged from choices, made one at a time, by a man who had learned early that the world would not offer him anything he did not find a way to hold himself. He rewarded the people around him, not for who they had been born to, but for what they were willing to do. In a world organized entirely around bloodline and belonging, this was something genuinely new, and it held, at least for a time, across a distance that no single authority had ever managed before. The blood brother he loved and eventually faced as an enemy, the wife he crossed a great distance to bring home, the mother whose voice he carried with him through everything that followed. These were not footnotes to the larger story. They were the grain running through the center of it, the personal thread that made the enormous thing human, rather than merely vast. He died in the summer of 1227, somewhere in the field, mid-campaign, as he had lived. He was somewhere near 65 years old. The burial was conducted in secret, the site chosen with the intention that it would never be found. And it never has been. There is no marked grave, no monument at the place where he was laid down. The earth simply received him, the way the steppe receives everything eventually, quietly, without ceremony, without leaving any visible sign of what passed there. What was left behind was not a monument. It was a world that had been moved. The roots remained open long after the empire that had secured them began to soften at its edges. Scholars and merchants and travelers moved along those roads, carrying things that would reshape the places they arrived in. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, art, ways of thinking that had been developing in one part of the world and had not yet reached another. The opening of those routes belongs in its origins to one life lived on the steppe. The losses belong there too. 40 million is the number historians return to most often when they try to account for the full weight of the campaigns, a number so large that it resists being held clearly in the mind. Cities that had stood for centuries did not survive. Populations that had built and maintained those cities were reduced beyond recovery. The weight of that does not soften with distance or with time, and it would be a dishonest telling to let the roads and the ideas ease it into something simpler. Both of these things, the opening and the loss, the building and the breaking, belong to the same man, to the same life, to the same long story that began on an empty plain, with a boy who had been left with nothing. He is buried somewhere unmarked beneath the ground he rode across for most of his life. His image appears on the currency of the country that holds him as a founding ancestor. His name is spoken, 8 centuries on, with reverence in some places, and with the weight of memory in others. He was a man shaped by extraordinary circumstances, who shaped the world in return, not gently, not without cost, but with a completeness that no single life before or since has quite matched. What it means to hold all of that in one thought, at the end of a long evening, is something each person arrives at in their own way. There is no neat resolution waiting at the end of a life this large. There is only the story itself, and the long quiet that follows when the telling is done. A boy on the steppe, a man who moved the world, and somewhere between those 2 points, everything that it means to be human, the loyalty and the ruthlessness, the love and the loss, the things we build and the things we leave behind. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.